How much money do you need? I cannot tell you how many times I've started with that question and been met with either a blank stare, because it's such an awkward question to come from someone who's about to give you money or you're thinking about giving money to. But the nature of my question was, what does it take for your operation to completely do its job? Now, the reason I had to ask that question first was it was my one way of figuring out how we could be a part of your work. And what we needed to know was the full scale of your work, because it helped us figure out how to help you. So this is the power of story, and this is the power of budget, and this is the power of being able to communicate what it is you do. And so when I asked that question, I once asked it of a newly minted executive director of a very large organization that was functioning during the Cold War behind the Iron Curtain, what was known as the Iron Curtain. And he had just come from the field, was deeply respected in his organization, was a very smart and faithful man who had spent years working in the toughest places you can imagine to establish the gospel among some of the hardest people to get it across to, who believed that, and were taught that, the state takes care of the poor. And so that's the environment he came out of, was this European atmosphere of ennui towards the gospel and the fact that the state did social action. And here he is now at the head of this large ministry that had, at that time, 150 what we used to call preaching points or working points. 150 folks out. So one of my board members was one of his board members, asked me to go down to the office and sit and talk with him. So the first question I asked was the question that gives me perspective. So when the conversation turned over to me, I said, so how much money do you need? And this guy looked at me for a while, and he said, $300,000, which is a substantial amount of money. But it was way lower than I knew the budget of the organization to be, and I was confused by his answer. And was it that I'd asked the question wrong, or was it that he didn't understand the question and that I needed to explain it? Well, what it really came down to was I needed to explain the question because he really didn't understand it. Giving me that answer of $300,000, what he was basically saying is, in my office here, I have to raise $1.1 million to run this office, and I have $800,000 of it. I need $300,000 more. Well, what I knew about the ministry was that it had an extensive publishing and printing schedule, 150 missionaries or mission points in the field, and a very expensive office in a Western city in Europe and a very expensive office in the United States with easily 20 to 30 staff members in both offices. And so $300,000 for an American mission was not at all how I understood that they could fund this. So I kept pressing them. And finally, some little kid down at the end of the table, because there was a whole group of people there, jumped up and said, I know the number you need. He went to a computer, and after doing some calculations, came back, and the number was something north of $9 million. And what I was basically asking him was, as CEO, what do you consider your responsibility? He considered his responsibility to be this small deficit in the national office. What it really was the entire budget of the organization. Every missionary that was out raising their own support, needed to be encouraged to finish and to get up to speed in their fundraising. as CEO, he was responsible for that, as well as the missionary was responsible for making their contacts. But overall responsibility was his. So he needed to look at his revenue streams from the point of view of the the office that he had and how to fund that and where to find that money. But suddenly he had become the captain of not a $300,000 mission, but of a $9 million, $10 million mission. And that weight of the responsibility of going from being a team leader to being the missions leader suddenly started weighing on him. Just through the simple question, how much money do you need? So let's make sure we can answer that question. Why is it difficult? It's because most of you work with multiple revenue streams. It's not sales in, product out. It's all sorts of things. Let's say you're directing an association, such as the National Association of Evangelicals in your country. How are you raising your money? Where does it come from? Let's say you're the director of a national evangelical alliance. What are your revenue streams? You have a commission that's raising money for relief and development. You have a conference that you're going to put on, and there's fees for that. You have a training seminar that you're running for the churches in your district. There's some fees there. You've got some fundraising because you have a couple of missionaries on staff that are raising their own money, but that's money for your work. I mean, that can be a little bit of it. You've got some grants that you're trying to get, and you got a job you're trying to do, and most of the time you're not being paid by the mission, you're being paid by the job that seconded you to the mission. So how do you answer the question, how much money do I need? Well, let me give you a simple little exercise that is going to be used from now on through all the rest of this coursework, and that is the preparation of letters of inquiry. This is the end product of understanding how your budget. That is, you break out everything in your ministry, everything that's done in your ministry, including the copy room and the receptionist, if it's a large ministry with a big office. Everything in your ministry can be expressed in your budget, and expressing it in your budget tells a very big story to whoever's reading your proposal. Because when they come to the budget, if they're discerning, they will discern what's important to you and what's not. Because what's important is what you're going to put front and center. And if you don't put it front and center in the proposal because you think the donor doesn't want to know what's important to you, and so you put what you think is important to them, right there is the breakdown of fundraising and the breakdown of communion. What this actually comes down to is trust. Trust in you, that you actually know this work. You know what it takes to do it. You know where you need new revenue. You know where you've ended programs. You need to be able to communicate that. And so one of the devices that we're going to use is your letter of inquiry. A letter of inquiry is simply a one-page document that explains a strategy that you have to accomplish your calling. And so that one-page document, if you create one of those one-page documents, like this one that you see, for every one of your strategies, including your office expenses, everything else, I should be able to total up all of those letters of inquiry and know your total budget. That's what a summary budget would show me, is that all of these projects cost this. And if I was to total it up, it would be the exact amount of money that you spend every year on mission, and no matter what the source of it is, and no matter what the outpay goes to, whether it's for groceries or rent or buying a new truck to get out to the field a little further, all of that is expressed in this. And that book of letters of inquiry actually forms the basis of communication of everything you do on your website, your social media, in your proposals. And we're going to learn how to build those. And you can see the elements here. It's a paragraph of the strategy, a paragraph of the reason for the strategy, and a budget that says this is how much money this strategy costs, this is how much we have raised. All of that flows naturally out of your planning diagram, which we will also go into, where you meld the three questions. What is God showing me? What is he telling me to do and about it? And how will I know I'm doing it? So if you look at this diagram with question 1 formed down into question 2 on the bottom side there that says, what is God telling me to do about it? There's this Holy Spirit nexus where you pray from what you've seen, you pray from what you think you're doing, and then out of that comes this answer to question 3, how will I know I'm doing it? And then from that, as you can see, every single one of your strategies, everything you need to spend money on or find volunteers for or get for free or whatever it is you need to do, needs to be included in the cost of every one of those strategies, and that budget tells a story. Why is story so important? Why do we keep bringing this up? Think about how you learn things and how you remember things. Not only do budgets tell stories, but the small stories that show how your work impacts the transformation, those are the critical stories as well. And we're going to spend some kind of time on getting those stories right. But right now, these LOIs tell your story. And what is the power of a story? Let me tell you a story about Bernie May, who was president of Wycliffe Bible Translators during the 80s and 90s. And Bernie started out at Wycliffe as a pilot, working down in the Bolivian, Amazonian region. And there was this one small people group that they were flying into and that they had done a translation with. And this group had a practice of when the man in the family died, the wife was taken and literally thrown off a cliff. This practice is more prevalent than you think in societies where the man is the provider. And so with the provider gone, she became a liability. They just distribute the stuff among the families, and you can imagine that's a fairly difficult place to be a woman. The way Wycliffe works is that a translator, in this case, goes into that village and hires a translation helper, usually the top elder in the village or the chief or somebody of very high stature in the village who can help them figure out how to create a written language so that they can read the Bible for themselves. And they translate word by word. What's your word for tree? What's your word for dirt? What's your word for water? All the basic things that you can think about that go into it before they can get into the concepts of forgiveness and atonement and all the rest of it that goes into the richness of the gospel that helps change our lives. And the translator had been working for several years in the village, and a man died. And he knew that they were preparing the ceremony with his funeral for his wife. And so he decided to move out of translating one of the Gospels. He decided to go to the book of James. His translation helper had come to believe in Jesus. And so he took this passage in James and read it out to him in his language. And said, let's begin translating this. Found in James chapter 1, verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows. to look after orphans and widows. That word changed everything. The village chief had become a follower of Jesus. When he saw that God wanted him to look after widows and orphans and not discard them, he was immediately convicted. We've all experienced the word convicting us. Have we ever experienced something quite this dramatic? He ran out of the hut where he was working, told the entire village, we are not going to do this practice anymore. And he actually laid out a support schedule so that the widow was actually looked after by the rest of the community. And from that point forward, that community became fully believers. And a little funny aside, a little later, at the end of a translation process, there's a ceremony. And at the ceremony, the chief in the village is given their written language for the first time they've ever seen their words written out in a language that they helped create. And so Bernie is sitting off to the side at the ceremony. Everybody's eating lunch and doing the various things you do in ceremonies like that. And Bernie's sitting off to the side with the chief and a few of his elders. And he's saying so. And Bernie's kind of, just full of the moment and how exciting it is. Because, this is a couple of decades worth of work that's now come together. And so he looks out at the elder and the chiefs and the chief and the elders, and he says, so what do you think of all of this? This coming of your village coming to Christ and you all following the Lord now. He says, well, the chief says, I want you to understand something, Bernie. When you came here, as men, all we did was hunt and fish and tell stories. The women did all the work. That's all changed. That's the power of word. And that little story helped me understand completely what it is Wycliffe does and why they do it. And that's the power of story. That saved widow. The whole story of Wycliffe can be condensed into her story, because that's what the gospel's about, is Jesus changing things. And that's what you're about, is transformation. And what we're doing when we talk about budgets and all the rest of it is we're taking the transactional action of bringing money in and showing how it's turned into a transformational action by the work that you do. That's the purpose of story. Remember, budgets tell stories.